we understand construction. I think how we can help is identifying that risk up front and enabling the transparency that our tools bring to the table.
Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's always good to have you with us. And we're back. Dale, how are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thank you. We're missing Martin this one, so I think you and him are taking turns to miss episodes.
No, that's all right. We don't need him. It's good to have you, though.
Thanks.
Oh, that's all right. And Hezron Ricketts, my friend, how are you, mate?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back. It looks quite sunny over there, pal, but it's pretty cold and dark over here. Middle of winter.
It's not bad. I'm just about, I don't know, maybe a kilometre away from the Sydney Harbour Bridge, so maybe I'll share the view in a second.
Nice.
But we did have to change the agenda for today a little bit because we're missing one person. I won't say who, Joe.
Yeah, we won't say who.
But look, we can roll with the punches, and I think it's great that we can talk about something that actually Dale and I have a little bit of knowledge about, but you can obviously help us shape it and challenge it. And I actually think it's pretty relevant. I think in Australia as well, we have a lot of rail projects going on at the moment. And I could argue, are they being done well? I won't say anything about that, no comment. But I think as well, there's a lot of people out there asking or curious about what we can do on these types of projects because they are difficult. Rail projects in particular, they have something for everyone is what I say. So I think it's a really fascinating space. And there might even be some people curious about how you get into rail projects, which I think maybe we could explore. But Hez, how did you get into these types of projects? Where did it start for you?
That's a good question actually, because I started my career out in for a company called KBR that work in oil and gas and government and infrastructure, but not too, in the UK anyway, not too much in the rail sector. I started as an apprentice there actually, and then following that, I went to work on the Olympics before London 2012 for Atkins, like some of the early enabling works, design works, and stuff like that. But I think, I'm from London, right? And being in London, growing up in London with, TfL, London Underground, having the oldest, metro system in the world, it's the heartbeat of the city, right? And I always sort of wanted to be involved at some point, working on some of the projects. And I started off, I was a contractor actually for a while, and you know what it's like, and when your contract finishes, you gotta find somewhere to go, something to do, and planning. I think last time I was on the pod, we spoke about the transferable skill set and taking it from one sector to the other. And I went in, and like anything, you got to start somewhere, right? You learn, and I've been fortunate. I think I've worked on HS2, I've worked for Network Rail, I've worked on several London Underground projects. And I've always enjoyed them. I think there's a rigidity, I suppose, around rail projects because of the safety aspect, and generally you're spending from the public purse. And controls in particular. So the requirement for controls and control over what you're spending, certainty of outcomes on a project. It's a bit more stringent. I actually quite like it. I think the traditional construction industry isn't as strict in many places, but TfL, London Underground, my first job. I worked on Brixton Station modernisation, King's Cross Station modernisation, the Bank Station capacity upgrade for TfL, digital rail programme for Network Rail, HS2. I was there for a long time. That was one of my favourite jobs to work on actually, and that's gone through its ups and downs over the last few years and will continue to do so. You're trying to introduce the new technology set into an existing ecosystem infrastructure, and it's something new for the country. But I think innovation is great for everything, and you've got to push the boundaries and see where we take ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be back in the Stone Ages, right? We wouldn't even have a railway.
No, exactly. And I think the common thread for all of us is the London Transport for London or contractor side working on some of these amazing rail projects. and that's actually where Dale and I met, as you know. And you've been on our show before, and Dale had to remind me before we press record, episode 51. 51, now we're up to 155 or something, so it's good to have you back, Hez.
Thank you.
Look, the challenge I think we have is a lot of people don't really know what's involved in a heavy rail project. So maybe if you could help us kind of paint the picture to start with, a bit of a landscape architecture of exactly what's involved in kind of a mega project like a rail upgrade or maybe a station upgrade.
Well, I mean, that's a massive question. We could spend more than the time we've got allocated for this to talk about it. But, you know, I think so take Network Rail, for example, and the rail infrastructure, the incumbent rail infrastructure in the UK as it is. First things first, it's an operational railway, right? So any changes that need to be made needs to bear in mind, factor in that you've got people living their lives, going about their business that need to use an asset that's in play. I think I mentioned safety just then already as well. You know, there were a few major incidents that happened back end of the 90s where, and they have, you know, we've had plenty of them over the years where there've been high profile, you know, losses of life, accidents on the railway. And so it's a highly regulated environment for starters. So, you know, when we look at the costs of some of the railway projects in comparison to the tangible asset that you see at the end of it in comparison to some construction projects, say, firstly, there's probably a factor of 2 or 3, maybe in some cases more, new technology, you know, multiples up to 10. You know, you look at the HS2, one of my previous projects, people look at the price of the project or the cost, at least at the outlet of the project, and they balk at the prices. But when you consider you've got 1,000 passengers on a train traveling at 150, 200 miles high-speed rail, right? You know, and you've got trains running in close proximity to each other, and you're expecting to get to where you get to, we take for granted the fact that we're going to get there safely. So first things first is the regulation and the disruption that you're going to cause to people's lives, right? So different countries in the world have got varying degrees of maturity around their railway system. So US, I suppose, is probably a stark contrast to what we have in the United Kingdom, where, you know, they're heavily reliant on their highways and the road network, and also the aviation industry is massive there in comparison. People take flights there, where we take trains, you know, on the point to point, obviously a much larger country, and the adoption of high-speed rails obviously is growing in momentum there, which is great. Some great opportunities, I think, for people to go and work over in the US on some of those projects. But so laying out a rail project starts from that point of disruption day to day as well. If you're working on an existing asset, it might have been there for 100 years, you know, maybe more. I worked on a project for Network Rail, the digital railway long-term deployment plan. Fascinating project, looking at deploying ETCS, so the European Train Control System, to upgrade the signalling systems on our trains from line of sight signalling on the side of the track to in-cab signalling, where you can then go into a traffic management centralized railway. So you can bring trains closer together, run them faster. Where you've got single track running, you can optimize your railway, get much more capacity out of what you've got without having to go and, you know, dig up the countryside and lay more track down, which is very expensive, right? So we had to plan out the implementation of ETCS across silence your phone, mate. We had to plan out the deployment of this, you know, as a more of a feasibility project to see what it would cost over a series of control periods in Network Rail's, you know, environment. And not just that, coupled with retrograding the rolling stock across the whole of the network, because the way we work in the UK, we've got train operating companies awarded, you know, cycles of running of a route, right? And they go for sometimes 5 to 10 years, sometimes longer. But depending on how the volume of trains running through, it's like kind of like a hand-me-down system in some of the areas where you've got you've got a less traffic on the line, say, some of the big heavy commuter lines, West Coast Main Line, stuff like that. The trains on there, like bright, flashy, fancy trains, stuff like that, right? But you go to Wales, right, and they've got like 2 or 3 generations of rolling stock that was used on other lines in the country, and we needed to plan out how you would firstly upgrade all the infrastructure in sequence, and we had to deal with all of the routes across the whole of the country, and sort of go through this bartering process of who's gonna get first dibs on this, because it's a lucrative business as well, especially for some of the TOCs. Getting the ability to run a service with this modern technology like they have, it's deployed massively in other parts of Europe, for example. It's massive for them. So, but they've also got to tie it in with what their maintenance regime is, and the life expiry of their current assets when they've got to go and do work. So you try to plan it in when's best to fit for them, but they've got to barter it with this other route and working all that out. So, we've got an annual timetabling, and sometimes it's quarterly in parts of the country, but timetabling process where, people think, oh, they've changed the times of my trains come New Year, and that it's an easy process. It's not. It's, the reliance on our railway system is massive, and then you tie that into light rail, metro systems that all feed as a network off the back of it. You've got all of that, right? But so take HS2 for example. So fresh slate, right, in terms of a railway. We had to involve railway systems 20 years before you're going to be running a train. Yeah, so you've got to think about and you think about technology, how quickly it moves. We talked about this on our last pod, right? How quickly do we evolve through technology? Look at it now, like every other year, the advancements in our capability. How do you plan for something in 20 years' time? What does a train look like in 20 years' time? What's the technology is it's on it? What are the systems that it's using? So, but bringing it back to the service and what the user experiences as well. A lot of what we talked about is trying to think outside the box in terms of what's the passenger experience. Now, we used when did I join HS2? 2014. People use tape, still using a lot of paper tickets. That's moved on since then. Even we've got apps on our phones. We just slide through, or we touch our Apple Watches, or we touch our contactless cards and stuff like that. What the train station looks like, what the gate line looks like, if there is even a gate line in 20 years' time, in 50 years' time, 10 years' time, 5 years' time, 2 years' time. Trying to imagine all the human factors. Also, what routes are people going to be taking? So when we last spoke, we were in the middle of a pandemic. That changed the way of working for the world. So all of these things aside, people give the government a hard time, right, when we're talking about building infrastructure and how we manage it. It's not easy. There are so many variables, so many factors, and every pound that's spent is scrutinized to the nth degree. So firstly, strategic planning, getting your blocks down long term. Where do we need to get to, but allowing yourself the scope to move at key stage gates of what you're doing, allowing for the implementation or the adoption of new technologies, designing for changes, for evolution in what you're doing. Another project I worked on, the bank capacity upgrade, we called it innovative contractor involvement at the time. The procurement methodology we applied to awarding the job. And on that project, Simon Adiman, at UCL now, project director at the time, was a key advocate for this. And we looked at how we, rather than letting a set of requirements based on a design, we tendered the project saying, we want this passenger footfall, we want this passenger flow. Here's the parameters you can work within. give us a solution. But the cost, cost of tendering is massive on some of these mega programs. If you weren't the successful tenderer, we offered to buy the innovation off of you. So I feel so fortunate that I've worked on some of these projects, and innovative contractor involvement, as we called it at the time, or sometimes it's called early contractor involvement now. That was one of the first. It was the first TfL project that used it, and I feel very grateful for the fact that I got to experience that, and now it's adopted on most projects. You look at any tender documentation for some of these major programs, and it's there, right? So the short and long answer is it's very complicated. Where do you start? Look, fundamentally, laying track down, in the countryside is, we did it hundreds of years ago. It's not massively different. There are different methodologies, types of track. HS2 talking about ballast. Talking about track that's just laid out on concrete. It's a minefield, but this is why we need people. I think we spoke about it last time. Is AI and machine learning and technology going to supersede human necessity on projects? But there are so many variables that are based on socioeconomic factors, things like that. We'll always be here for that. And you need people with experience, you need innovators, and you need people that are able to think in the shoes of the consumer, the general public, the users, beyond the next 2-3 years, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Long answer, sorry.
That's great. I think and I think everyone will appreciate it. I mean, obviously, people who don't know some of these acronyms will just have to be careful. But Transport for London is obviously the City for London, the rail representative and authority. So we worked with them, and I think I was more of a contractor side. But I see rail as I said, a pretty exciting space for people to join and get involved in, because it does have a little bit for everyone. I kind of see it as almost like a three-way stream, almost, where you have kind of the hard build, which is the physical work, the soft build, which is the software and all the integrations of those platforms, and then you have the paper trail, which is around the safety and all the other documentation that's required to get these things moving. And I think the fascinating part of that is then how do you build systems around that to help manage and control the performance of the projects? And I think we've all struggled from time to time and probably had 1 or 2 late nights to try and figure out, because there's no set place and no set plan that would really help you govern everything together. I think it's a bit of a hybrid model, and I've seen some things work and some things not work. But what worked for you, Hez? What have you seen work in terms of managing a project like that?
Really, it's about, it depends on the stage of the project that you're in, right? So if you're going from feasibility, early stage, just whether or not you can or cannot do something, there you need the minds that have been there and done it. They have an understanding of what the overall requirement is, and how why are you building this in the first place? I think HS2 has been called a vanity project probably 100,000 times or more in the press. Really, it's not about the speed. It's not about high speed. Okay, that's going to innovate and push forward our railway in this country, right? But it's more about capacity. You take the point to point, the city to city travel onto the high speed lines. You free up the capacity on commuter lines, right? So you've got more commuter services that sit and stop at stations that you normally fly past when you're going from London to Birmingham or London to Manchester. So understanding people who understand the need, and what the master plan is, city master plans, what the country master plan is 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. I think HS2 initially was initiated on the basis that the UK as a UK PLC, right, there are emerging economies, emerging powers in the world that were looking at GDP growth in the 7-8% per annum, and we're at 2-3%. and you think about where that puts the UK in 20, 30, 40, 50 years time, you have to invest. Your investment needs to be about making the UK and connecting the UK as well to Europe, both passenger and freight. A lot of people don't talk about the freight value of a job like HS2 or many of the railway projects. We look at freight on the roads, people complain about HGVs and all this sort of business, but the silent workers in the evenings that run along the lines, right? The odd lines that are open in the evenings, the freight on the railway lines. So I think you need people that understand why at that stage of a project. When it comes to delivery, laying track down or station development, building stations, it's no different to any construction project. Other than the proximity to the railway, it's no different. You look at the key players, Balfour Beatties, stuff like that, the Kias of the world, they work in every facet of construction across the projects industry, here and worldwide. They're the same people. They're just specialisms and people that are used to working in proximity. So safety, right? If there's a live railway working against a line that you're laying out, you need to be aware of factors. So that's no different. But when we talk about systems, railway systems, I think that's the real niche. That's the real difference maker. People that, and they're hard to come by. And I think TfL have struggled, over the last few years. I know you both have been around some of the projects that we know and love, but the systems understanding in Transport for London, I think, second to none. But getting the younger generation in through that, and people that have been there, and you kind of need to just do your time on those projects, on those in those railways. You need to understand maintenance. You need to understand life expiry of your assets. And we'll probably come and talk to this later, but asset management and asset life, we don't, taking that away from paper into the digital world, digital twin, so that there's no right answer. This is why, and I think your point about the fluidity and it being a great place for people to start, there is something for everybody, even if you don't work in the built environment space in railway. Even if you work in the operational side of a railway, whether it be railway operations, maintaining running a line, or station operations, it's all we all get to experience it one way or another. Whether you're walking through a station, or whether you're sat on a train that stops, the issues affect us every day. So it's a great place to start. It has everything, and then you've got things, so you take. TfL, I think, and Network Rail especially, one of the biggest landowners in the country. Oversight developments. Look at all of the stations in London now, Manchester, Birmingham. You've got massive oversight developments that they've turned them into these like cathedrals around the city. Look at Crossrail, Tottenham Court Road Station. If you haven't been there, it's one of the most impressive stations in London by a long way. And I think that artistic license as well is important, because when you go and visit a city, especially in Europe, one of the key things is, how do I get around? And if a good city, I think, is somewhere where you can either walk or you get public transport. You don't have to take a taxi, you don't have to drive. You can cycle, you can take a tube, take a metro, or you can walk. But giving character and being true to the values of what the architecture is to the city, what the cultural, drumbeat is, what the vibe of the city is, I think is important as well. So even if you're an artist, you can work in the railway. It's got something for everybody. So, and you're going to impact people's lives. You're going to make a difference, right? Leave a lasting legacy. Yeah, no, absolutely has. And I'm laughing there. I'm just picturing Val trying to sort of, bid for putting a platform on top of the Opera House in Sydney, having a station there, perhaps. Maybe a junction, who knows? Great view. But no, you're right though. Like there's so many avenues we can go down with this particular topic, because on the face of it, let's face it, those of
those listeners that haven't worked on rail projects, they might think, actually, it doesn't sound that sexy. It's railway. Like, what you can do, you can put, as you say, you put railway down, you order the rolling stock, you get the rolling stock in, you put some signaling on, boom, done. It's all good. Happy days, right? But those of us that have worked on it know all the ins and outs, and it is a system. It is absolutely a system. And let's start at the top, and then we'll break it down and go into the granular detail. And you spoke about it being called a vanity project for a good few years now. But if we look at the heart of it, potentially why it's been called a vanity project, let's look at the options for transportation, public transportation. You mentioned air, right? So planes. You mentioned rail, road. Okay, you can put in, I guess, boats in there if you wanted to. But, I mean, for all intents and purposes, let's just keep it out for now. Yeah. But if you compared those three, I think the stats are there to tell us that rail actually is the one that pollutes the least, right? And so there's real benefit to the global world, for putting rail down. So is it really a vanity project, or actually does it contribute to helping with climate change? Potentially, depending, again, on how it's delivered, right? Because it's a system. It's not a straight black and white answer. So if we start there, we understand, okay, perhaps why rail is better for the human race and the world than planes and cars, right? And particularly where we're getting into space now where everything's electrified and, you don't have the old steam engines, coal on board, someone shoveling it in anymore. Yeah, although that's pretty cool to go on and take the picture and everything, it's not that great. But then if we break it down further and get into the mundane bit about rail of, you just chuck some track down. Let's start there, right? Why isn't it as easy as just putting track down? Isn't it just all standardized these days? It's the same track, it's easy to put down. There's no real considerations. We've been doing it for years. We know how to lay track. Isn't that easy?
Yes, I suppose if you think about it from that perspective, it is. But if let's take the example of a motorway that runs alongside a railway, there are track laying methods that allow you to, to work in a confined single track rail environment but again, you're talking about factors of multiplication in the cost, right, to do this. But you can't, so HS2, right, we'll come back to it. So the main work civils contractors that are working on HS2 right now, there are parts of the UK where it looks like there's close to, 400 meter, whatever, wide strip that's been torn out of the countryside in some cases, and going through villages, going through golf courses, going through whatever. There are tunnels involved, right? So one of the biggest issues with railways is the grade, right? Lug in, hundreds of thousands of tons, with pace, at a pace up a hill is hard. You don't get very high grades on a lot of railway lines. It's inefficient. It doesn't allow for running at speed. Traditionally as well, rolling hills would have prevented line of sight. This is why there's a push to move to railway signaling systems that allow for in-cab, operation that don't rely on line of sight. So the gradients are key, but you think about all of the machinery, all of the construction machinery that needs to be involved in order to lay or prepare the ground to lay a railway. And how many railways do you see that have loads of access roads running all the way up the side of them? You don't, right? So there are modular systems. There are track laying systems that you can that are in play, and it's technology, right? There are more so, but similar. Let's take tunneling for example. Big tunnel boring machine. But if I need to lay a stretch of railway that's 10 kilometers long, or I need to lay a stretch of railway that's 200 miles long, it's economies of scale, right? You don't see a lot of tunnel boring machines for 2 mile tunnels, that you do for much longer tunnels. So that's why it's difficult. You've got to get into remote areas. You need land access. One of the biggest contributing cost factors to any new railway project is the land acquisition. And it's not just the land, the little railway line that you see on a map. You look above, okay, it's 10 meters wide or whatever. You're talking about access. You're talking about how do you actually get to build that? How do you get there to do it? How do you get the materials there? Sometimes you've got a good free run at it, and some railway lines fly down because you've got railway, you've got railway operating machines that can just they can bring it in, lay it out, bang bang bang. You've got big sections of track that come in precast that just get plonked in, and those are great. But concrete is expensive, not just in cost but in emissions, carbon emissions. Every ton of concrete is like a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, something like that. So can we really afford to just go, okay, let's just pave the country so that we can lay these tracks down? I don't think that's an option. And you do need it in some cases because you need the tolerances of the railway to stay within margins to allow you to run at certain speeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you think about a road and what keeps your car on the road is this bit of grip, and we replace our tires on our cars, easily replaceable. If a train's going around the bend at 220 miles an hour, imagine the ground bed that needs to be underneath it, the layers of support that need to be there for you as a passenger to sit on that train in 100% assurance of safety that you're going to get to where you get to and get back to your family, or get to work, or do whatever you need to do. So you're talking about a massive scale up in the engineering requirements in order to get that train down. But then the payoff down the line is it's an asset that's going to be there. You might have 100 trains running, taking 1,000 people on, each train, 2,000 people.
So it's pretty clear that you can transport more people at quicker speed, right, using rail over road. Do we have the stats, or do you know the stats on the maintenance of road versus rail, and which one's cheaper, and which one contributes potentially less or more to the economy as well as to the environment?
Well, no, I mean, I don't have the stats, no. I don't
Come on, you're a project controls guy. You got all the stats.
No, but you want to get that? Yeah, I'm in the building side of the project. But to be fair, that's actually,
well. If we're to guess, where do we think it is?
How many roads are there compared to railway lines in the country? Last time I checked, have you driven in the UK recently? Do you see? I mean, we're just coming through winter, right? I don't know about you, but potholes are a thing.
Yeah.
If it was cheap,
warming and freezing, roads, plenty of potholes.
I'm pretty sure that they would all be fine, but they're not. Yes, we have railway maintenance issues, but generally, it's more controllable asset. We understand what's rolling over the top of it. We understand how frequently it's rolling over the top of it. There's safety inspections that happen much more frequently. Because of the safety requirements. So easily, I think, pound for pound, railway is much cheaper to maintain. Otherwise, we'd see a different road network to the railway network that we do in this country. That being said, there are limitations to rail because rail doesn't deliver you to your door, does it? In some cases, it does if you live in a city environment, but for most people, it doesn't. So, I don't think we can play them off against each other. But in terms of mass transit and metro transit, I think most cities, with a conscience at least nowadays, they're trying to minimise road usage. Don't get me wrong, it's inconvenient. We've all been on the roads where you're stuck in traffic, or they've closed this road for cyclists only, or they change gyratory systems and whatnot, which is sometimes not as thought out as it should be. But I think I think it's a no-brainer. All of the railway projects I've worked on, I looked at you look at the business case as well. I think you said, how much does it cost the economy? It doesn't really. So most, and this goes for road and rail, in all honesty, except maintenance aside. But your pound spent on a project, in rail or on a Highway to England project or whatever, it's not a pound spent. There's almost always a positive business case. Not least, every pound that you do spend, it's a pound that maybe 70, 80 pence of it goes back into the economy. Because if I work on the railway and I'm earning money for my, I've got to go and pay my bills. I've got to go shopping. I've got to get to work. The money that I'm earning, it's not money that's leaving the economy. It's a reinvestment. So, you see, whenever we're in a bit of a sorry state in the economy, when we're close to a recession or deep in a recession, infrastructure spend is the first place governments go to, because they're not really spending the money; they're investing in the future. I think on bank we had when we started, we had a positive business case of 1 to 4, and I think it's not diverged too far from that, but that's £4 for every pound that's spent. So you're not really spending money at all. You're actually investing for your future. You're investing for the future of your children, for the future of your cities, future of your country. So, but yeah, overall, I don't think it's even a question. Don't get me wrong, the maintenance of the railway system in the UK, and this is why we looked at rolling out the signalling system that will take us into, or keep us on pace with the rest of the world, actually, is because maintenance costs go up every year. Your asset diminishes. Every additional, like life year that you add of usage to your asset, the maintenance cost goes up by a percentage, and it's a compounding factor. So you get to the point where you look at what the control period spend is for Network Rail or the railway in its entirety. People talk about HS2 being expensive, but I think if people really had that understanding of what the holistic control period spend was just to maintain our existing railway, then they'd be shocked. They'd be shocked at the number of billions that it is every 6 years. So
yeah, no, you're certainly right. There's the money multiplier effect, right, to the economy, and I think certainly it's. I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily cost the economy. I think it's interesting because I don't think we can answer this because it's a system, right, and it's systemic, and which one contributes most, whether it's road, rail, or air, versus the pound going in. It feels like it's rail. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think we've got the stats. But I want to ask Val a question and bring him back in here, because I was just wondering, would you catch a high-speed rail from Brisbane to Sydney? What's the furthest you'd go in Australia? Would you go Melbourne to Sydney if it was a high-speed rail and took you, I don't know how many hours? Or would you still, even if it was better for the economy, better for everything, the climate and all that, or you'd still take a plane? What is the cost-benefit ratio or the break-even point for rail versus air transport? Because the UK is easy, right? It's a small island. But we're talking about the US and Australia and large continents. What is the break-even point for countries to decide actually it's worth investing in rail here because people will use it over air or any other transport?
It's such a good question. And Australia's in such a really unique position. I don't think until you've been here, it's very difficult to explain to people who come to Australia how big the landmass is. And how
5 time zones, isn't it?
It's absolutely nuts. And, I travel all around the country for work as a consultant. And so, air is really the only way to do that. But, if you want to be there on the same day, for example, but it is something that government has been tossing around with forever. Do we build rail? And then even, is it surface rail, or do we do tunnels? Because we do have problems with assets and particularly land acquisition. So, all of that coastal area is prime real estate for Australia. I mean, I think it's something like 70 to 80%, it might even be a bit higher actually, of Australian residents are on the coast. So, for as large and as beautiful as it is, there's nothing in the middle. And so it's it's going to be a very difficult thing to build and attract patrons when, currently air isn't too difficult and it's not too cheap. Too expensive. But I think there is a cost to benefit issue for, say, smaller travel routes. Like Melbourne to Sydney happens to be one of the most congested flight paths in the world, because a lot of people live in Melbourne, work in Sydney, for example. I'm in Sydney today. I'll be flying back tomorrow. So that path there is something that I think is on its way. I believe there are government plans to get that approved. I think there is something from Brisbane to Sydney, potentially. But if you talk about the horizontals, I mean, these are all verticals on the East Coast. If you start talking from, Melbourne to Perth, that's a scenic route. And, even with high-speed rail, you're going to take a while. I mean, to drive it from, if I'm in the middle, which is Adelaide, if I drive to Perth, that's a 5-day trip in a car. So the concept of anyone kind of considering rail as an option for that is probably pretty small, but it may change based on density. And this is back to your point, Hez, about, the 20-year plan. How do you plan for 20 years ahead, especially in urban development? And you're looking for areas where you may build, those hub cities that are between major cities. And we see that in Sydney, where you've got probably 5 major cities within that space. So they're kind of sprawling out. And then between them, we have some pretty big projects. Sydney's probably the most advanced because it's got the biggest density. You've got Sydney Metro, which is equivalent to a Transport for London type project. Brownfields, all the kind of difficult constraints you endure, except it's not 200 years old. They've got a pretty nice sweet spot there. And then you've got these Parramatta and a few outlying cities that'll be connected back in. The buzz for that is, can we do it? Do we have enough people? Which has been a really big challenge for us in the rail industry. So the skill set required to do signaling, particularly CPTC, so communication-based train control, which is most of what we're going through here. Also, Sydney, I guess from Sydney, similar to London, doesn't have a lot of space. So you're going to have to go underground. And, you talked about grades and where do you do that? Where do you go in and where do you come out? Is a very challenging question. So most of the time, I think in Australia, it's about upgrades, and we're a little bit behind you guys in terms of those high speed. We keep threatening ourselves with having high speed, but no one really knows what high speed is. I heard a term called higher speed the other day. I was what was higher speed? And it was somewhere between average speed and high speed. So that's in physical, that's in government documents. And so the cost benefit there, back to your point, Dale, not sure. I would love to see it between Melbourne and Sydney. I think that makes a really good use case. I think you would get patrons there. Would it be, from a time, it maybe would be like an 8-hour trip. It wouldn't necessarily be a very small trip either. So you're still talking like probably an overnight or something like that. Do you want to be on a train overnight?
Yeah, it depends how nice the train is.
Yeah,
exactly. So then the tickets go up, right? So the price then means that you probably get a cabin, and it's a little bit more comfortable. Maybe it's like business on a plane, so you've got a little bit of stretch room.
How long's the flight? Melbourne to Sydney. How long's the flight?
Melbourne to Sydney is probably about an hour and 10, something like that. So you can see why they use air, but with the cost of fuel, perhaps. And I would much prefer to be on the ground, to be honest. I don't necessarily like flying that much. I think it's concerning, especially with the strange weather we have here and across the planet. But I think rail, as you said, is it's a safe option, and it's usually cost effective for the patron, right? So the person the commuter who's getting on the train. But if that time difference is still going to be more than, let's say, a couple of hours, like, let's be honest, we're probably only a couple of hours before it becomes a bit of a nuisance. Then you probably don't have the traffic to really make it a real business case. So that's what we've got, that continental land mass and distance, unless we get something really high speed.
I think thinking about it from a systems approach, right? So there's no point in having point to point rail if you can't get to where you get to the other end. Yeah. So people they're not gonna take a train over driving if it takes them 3 times the time that it would have done on that train to get to where they need to get to from the train station to their end destination. So the systems need to work together, whether it's rail and road, rail and metro, air, rail, road, metro, whatever it is. It needs to be seamless to make that journey. And these systems make, like transportation is about bringing people or things closer together, and upgrading your transportation. So, when you build high-speed rail in the UK, you're talking about bringing the UK cities closer together. But you aren't bringing the whole of the UK closer together, because if you get to Birmingham, right, and it takes you another hour to get to North Wales or whatever it is, or 2 hours, or 3 hours, 4 or 5, if I don't know if you've ever driven from down to the southwest of England, but there's a road to A30 that goes down. Basically, you get past Bristol, and it takes you like from London to Bristol, it's like 2.5 hours, maybe something like that, and then it's like 5 hours. Like to go like the same distance again. So it's, I think everything, all of these systems got to come together in unison. So, I think you asked a question earlier, Dale, about, which one should we spend the money on, or what's a better pound spent or dollar spent or whatever. And there isn't, it's not, there's no, it all needs to be upgraded. The systems need to come together effectively. When you take a flight somewhere, if it takes you an hour to get out of the airport, if that hour flight for you is another hour getting out of the airport and then maybe 30 minutes getting in a taxi or whatever home, like, oh, okay, that end to end isn't really worth it for me. I'd be in the comfort of my own car for 4 hours. I'll do that. So people need a reason to travel. So bringing places closer gives people more reason to travel. There are less reasons to travel now with the internet, because we're all together, different sides of the planet. So that you need the incentive to do it, but you provide the incentive by building these systems up together and putting them into a package that allows people to, people want convenience, people want their lives to be easier. They want to do more with less time. And there's nothing worse than being in transit, right? That's like, but if you are, I think actually probably the best way to be in transit is on a train. Like, you can get up and walk around. The seats are usually bigger.
Yep.
You've got service on your phone or whatever. You've got internet. You don't, you're not going through what the body has to deal with in the cabin of a pressurized aircraft. You're not having to drive. It's smooth. You know what I mean? There's a trolley that comes along, and you can have a drink, have something to eat, whatever. Usually, I think it's probably one of the best ways to travel, if I'm being honest with you.
Well, I just jumped in there, Hez, and I just checked for Dale's purposes. And Brisbane to Sydney, there is rail there, but it's going to cost you 88 Australian dollars. So that's not bad.
Yeah,
it's not bad.
You're going to have to get up and catch a train at 4:55 in the morning, and you will get there at 8 o'clock at night. Just past 8 o'clock. So unless you're like, you've got super amount of time on your hands, and arguably, this is the other great thing about trains, Hez, you said, you've got space, but you can also work on the trains. You've got beautiful tables. Usually you've got a nice little set. If you can get a seat, you're great. Especially those regional trains, they're lovely. You can get in there nice and early, snug into a corner, get your laptop open and you can crack on. So if you're looking for the scenic route, you could probably do it and get away with it. Maybe I'll do a podcast on one of those trains, Dale. We'll just do a live feed or something. But do
your trains have internet?
Yeah, we're good. Oh, I think on the East Coast you're good. If you start going inland, I think that's when you're going to struggle. But I think back to your point, Hez, as well, that the challenge as well is once you've started building, let's say if we kind of move into delivery now. So we've agreed that there's a business case for it, and we're starting to build, and we've bought everyone's land, so now we've got land, and we've got the TBM ready. We've set that up, and we're starting to dig big holes in the ground. Hopefully we don't hit anything. Now, how do you monitor and control that? What's your what have you seen as really kind of gone that, that is a great ingenuity for this type of industry, because rail isn't a very old industry. It's been around for such a long time, and it's still marked with that connotation of like old technology, but actually rail today is quite modern. It has a lot of software challenges, as we know. And we were talking before we press record around, waterfall versus agile, but I think, that's kind of being light on touch. I think it's a lot more deeper than that. Do you want to get into that?
Yeah, of course. Well, look, from a physical infrastructure perspective, it's a linear project, right? So, we talk about tools in things like planning, stuff like that. It opens up the world for planning tools that that are more geared towards linear projects that allow you to visually look at what you're planning out. You know, the traditional Gantt chart put on something like a time chainage chart allows you to see what you're doing in a way. And I've done it on a few projects actually, and that's something that's different. And that's, you know, you don't get that outside of highways and railways and tunnels usually. But yeah, in terms of the systems side and, you know, the technology involved, the railway, you know, the trial ops on a railway, you know, the testing and commissioning phase of any railway project is a massive issue. And all of the people in civils are probably going to hate me for saying this, but whenever any rail infrastructure project usually starts, most projects, you know, the estimation isn't necessarily where it needs to be. We've had this conversation before. Most projects fail, right? But what happens when projects start failing is we keep the end date where it is, and we just like take a little bit of time off. So in 7 years' time, when we start testing and commissioning for this railway, new technology, we've not done it before, but no, we can do it quicker than we've ever done it before. Of course we can. We'll know it by then, right? So there's that issue. So the testing and commission usually get squeezed, but it never gets squeezed. It always takes as long as it's going to take. This is why, you know, a very large number of high-profile projects in the railway space, I won't name them, that have finished later than planned, albeit the infrastructure has been there for a while, right? So that understanding that piece at the end around how do I implement this new piece of software on a new piece of hardware on a new piece of infrastructure, and going back to the point around what systems are we going to be using. Yeah, so agile versus waterfall, you know, okay, great. You know, yeah, we need to go through cyclical iterations of what we're doing because it's not cast in stone like design, right? You know, we need to get to a point of advancement where we can bring everything together and then move forward. That's how our progress works, right? But how do you do that? Like when you've got multiple systems all talking to each other, where the architecture of systems are totally alien, we need to lend a bit of capability. So a little bit of stuff we do here at CPC, you know, CPC Systems, we've got a team that's blended of railway systems engineers, data scientists, coders, and they're looking at innovation in the way that and building products, you know, building digital products that allow us to manage a railway, maintain a railway, manage the introduction of systems into our railway. So I think we need to go beyond the traditional in this sense. We need to use machine learning. We need to use iterations of what we see on a digital twin of our asset, running through iterations, thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of times to see where we fall down. And that's how we tailor our configuration process, our configuration states of our systems, of how the railway works.
How are you doing that, mate? Sorry, just to jump in there, machine learning, because you mentioned, you know.
I mean, we aren't doing that machine learning now, but we should be. I can't say what the rest of the industry is doing, right? But in terms of machine learning and its adoption, so trial ops, for example, on a railway, how we usually bring a railway into use is about, you know, running a railway at increasingly difficult levels or closer levels to what you will be when you come to an operational railway, testing out where your failure points are, right? But that is a physical thing. So the same thing is applicable when we come to software or the software systems that now run our railways. And, you know, any modern railway nowadays coming into use, the drivers are more and more redundant. So if it's a machine that's running this railway in the first place, then we should be able to play out what happens. We should be able to throw curveballs into that system and see what happens when a train goes down this part of the track, where, you know, and map out what happens in a crisis, for example. What happens when there's a power shortage? What happens when there's a catastrophe that happens somewhere where there's a human intervention, you know, in a negative sense that that prevents us from running. So those are the things that we need to be thinking about, rather than some of the traditional methods of, how's our Scrum looking this week? How are we moving this agile project forward? But and on that front, I think the boundaries are endless. We look at other industries, manufacturing industries. It's a production line and particularly in rolling stock production as well. So I don't have all the answers, mate, I'm afraid. I don't know what you think on it, but it's got some way to go.
I haven't got the answers, but I've got ideas, and I think you're kind of touching on them. I think there's a lot of opportunity in rail. I think construction in general is probably, and I think I've seen something before, demonstrated in a very sad curve where kind of construction's the last to adopt really modern uses of anything. Really, we, for whatever reason, we stick to the physical. We try and keep it simple, but we end up complexifying it anyway. And then we don't adopt anything that's really very modern, which could have helped us in the first place. And the hard part is, there's two parts I think is really hard. Trying to put or change things once we've started is very hard. Mm-hmm. So implementing new ways of working, new systems or tools whilst you're in the delivery phase it's a really big risk. Two, there's a massive adoption challenge there and resistance. And three, you're not completely convinced that it's actually going to move the dial, because at that point, everything's set in motion. So if you're going to do it, I think that the real chance is, particularly for these big projects, is at the start. And I think Dale and I have said this, if you got project controls in at the onset, even in the bid stage, or during mobilization, once the contract has been set, or even during that part, there's a lot we could do to change the way projects are delivered. And one of the stuck states we get into is we don't know where we are. So if it's a linear project, and if you go into a shopping mall, they always have that big map, right? And there's a big red dot, and it says you are here. I love that. That's the best part of that map. You're like, shit, I don't have to navigate where I am. I know where I am. Now I need to figure out the rest. We don't do that very well on rail projects, because a lot of the time we're looking backwards. Yep. So by the time that information gets to us, and this is where it is, because it moves so fast and there's so many touch points, the difficulty is by the time we feed that up to management to make informed decisions, that information is old information. That information is from last month, 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago. Maybe the contractor's playing games, who knows? But that information is not valid. And then we make decisions on old information for new problems. And we get into this compounded effect. The opportunity is lost. You're nodding your head a fair bit. Is that something that's happened, or you see that happening in the industry?
Yeah, it does. So it does. And when I HS2, one of the parts of my job, the team that I worked in, was really looking at how we, what project controls, program controls, ecosystem are we building? Is he gone? What project controls ecosystem are we building, right? And a lot of it came down to, when I get my month-end report, what's the oldest piece of information in that report? But it's being reported as new, right? So that might be 2 months, 2.5 months, 12 weeks old, that information. How are you supposed to make a decision 12 weeks later? Governance is a big issue on this. Governance reporting, delegated authority. That takes away a lot of it, right? But project control systems, digital PMO systems that allow for real time reporting, real information that's almost instant. But even yesterday's information is good enough in most cases. Something happened last night. What are we going to do about it today? That should be like a minimum expectation, shouldn't it? Like on most of these projects.
Yeah, it should. It's that speed of data, right? Like how do you get like that speed of data, as you say, all the way through the processes of processing the data into information? And you're right, we've got the techniques today. But I think you're right as well, where we don't necessarily have everyone that's got the capability to use those techniques and those tools today, and they've not been upskilled yet.
if I gave you an example, right? Say you're on your computer, your laptop or desktop or whatever it is, and you've got to play a game, right? There's a ball or something floating around, like, can you remember Pong, whatever the old game? And you've got to click your mouse on it every like 10 seconds where it is tracking the ball, right? And at its pace, refreshing on the screen. If you're using an old dial-up modem versus fiber broadband, that's the same analogy. Like, your information's just like lagged and delayed on that dial-up modem. So how sure can you be? Like, project controls, project management is about estimating certainty. How much is this going to cost? When is it going to be complete? What am I going to get at the end of it? Where am I now from that point? So it's the same. It's the same thing in that analogy. Like, you got to, but we've got the tools there. The tools, the technology is well there. It's long gone. Actually, it's well past the point of that. What we you've got real time data, teraflops of data in financial industries, for example. They're getting churned every minute.
No.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're so far away from that. We probably don't even need to get to that point, obviously, but then again, maybe we do. Like, we're probably going to be at 10, 20 years from now, construction projects are probably going to be an augmentation of physical working labor and, IoT connected robots, machinery that is doing a lot of the work for us, the physical work. So actually, we might get to we probably do need to think about that. You know what I mean? And when we're talking about data and safety and all of the information that any one of these devices or bits of machinery that are connected need to be able to compute, relay, adjust for, talk to each other, actually, yeah, we should. Because the technology's there now, it's just mobilization, right? And there are some robotics that are happening in the construction industry already. A lot of accelerators, a lot of tech hubs around the world, experimenting with that, and they have done for years. But again, it's cost, right? It's cost, but it's not just cost. It's the same reason we don't have driverless cars in every country of the world right now. There is and coming back to the railway, safety. We talked about the construction industry being last on the curve of adoption. Well, the railway industry is a little bit further behind that because safety is the most important thing.
What's the safest mode of transport?
By statistic, I think it's actually railway.
I think it's actually airplanes.
Do you think so? Oh, yeah. No. I mean, it may well be. I think there's a more stringent testing and rigor around planes generally.
Yeah. But to your point around machines, robotics, etc., right? I had this conversation, and I actually spoke about this quite recently, but I had a conversation about 5 years ago now, with a retired airline pilot. I won't name it. It's a large airline. And he was instructing now. So he was training new pilots coming in. And I said to him, I was like, so I've heard and read and seen that airplanes these days on autopilot don't just fly after they've taken off and landed. They can actually, on autopilot, take off and land by themselves. Yeah. So why do we still have pilots? And he laughed at me. He said, there's one reason there are still pilots that get onto planes. And he said, that is because of the passengers. He said, how many passengers would get on a plane if there was no one in the cockpit? Because he said, a lot of what happens on a plane can be fixed remotely. And actually, a lot of things that go wrong during a flight is because of human error. Yeah. Right? So if you brought that then into, okay, I know we're talking about CBTC and sort of, other forms of driverless train. But the safety aspect in robotics exists today. It existed at least 5 years ago, if not longer, right? In aeroplanes. Sure. And so if we can then program machinery that flies in the air to be safe, right? Surely we can program machinery to construct something like a railway, which is linear. So then you almost supersede or surpass the need for data analytics and 3D modeling, etc., because everything's programmed and nothing has to be seen, consumed to make decisions, because it's programmed to make the decisions as it's constructing it. I think the one caveat is, and I had this conversation with Alan Moscow, who I think you know as well.
Yeah,
and I said to him, well, in my mind, could we just SimCity the hell out of construction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, great idea, but he said, large language models, machine learning, relatively easy. Simulations, really hard. And now that's where I was out of my depth, because I don't know how that it all works. But in my mind, I'm like, well, surely if we can simulate all of the environmental factors, if we can simulate everything that might go wrong, you end up with a playbook, right?
Yeah.
And then,
exactly,
as you say, you go one step further. If you don't need humans to deliver, and you program that playbook into robots, little ants, to go and deliver. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe they're not little ants. Maybe they're big ants, big gigantic ants.
And
they go and they construct this. So all of a sudden it's safe, because if something does go wrong, there's no human lives involved. But then what do we do? Go sit on the beach, all of us?
Well, I mean, this is the question, isn't it? I think this is the question that, like the existential question that faces any species that has something that's more capable than it in certain facets.
Yeah.
I don't think we've got a choice. I think it's already happening and will continue to happen.
We're on the trajectory, right? Heading towards the matrix.
We're on the journey already, right? Whether it be flying or rolling along some railway lines, but we're on it already. And I think we just need to embrace it. I think, change, we've had to change a few things around in this podcast, right? And this is projects. This is what happens, adopting to change. When things change last minute, what do you do? We probably worked on autopilot in this situation, excuse the pun, but we things change, and having the ability, but generally when you're in an environment that is tightly controlled, as your pilot friends talk to you about, the issues usually come from human intervention. So why don't we concentrate on doing things that we want to do, or that we're better at doing, and let the machines do the things that they're better at doing?
No, absolutely. Make the mistakes before you have to put anything in the ground, right? In the virtual world. Exactly. Anyway, hell of a interesting conversation. And Val's ninja bombed.
He has
say goodbye. But thanks for leaving us, Val. We love you too.
Yeah. Is it something I said?
No, I think he actually realized he was late for another meeting again. So
no, that's fair. We've all got to work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or in your and I's case, we've all got to sleep now, right?
exactly. But here's it. So go ahead.
No, I said I've got to get home first. But
Fair enough. Look, no, it's been a fascinating chat with you, as always. We always knew it would. I think, if anything, we provided the listeners with a hell of a lot to think about, particularly when thinking about rail. As you say, it takes a lot from inception to getting a passenger boarding the train and using it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to think about, as you say, impacts to the economy, impacts to the environment. And when I say impacts, I don't necessarily mean negative. There's both negative and positive. So it's a lot to consider. It is a system. It's not a closed system as well. And so we don't always get it right. But I guess in general in projects, that's why projects exist, is it's so that they can be managed, and things go wrong. And every project is a form of change or transformation. So it's one of the reasons we're in this game, and makes it interesting and fun. But look, before we let you go, Hez, were there any final thoughts you want to leave the listeners with?
No, just like I think Val touched on it earlier. I think we've been quite lucky in some of the experiences that we've had. There is something for everybody in rail, as well. Dare I say, in railway systems, there is as well. You've got you could be looking at how you impact people's lives, really, what their experience of the world is. So yeah, just give it a consideration, and yeah, embrace the change, I think.
Absolutely. Embrace the change. I couldn't think of better words to end off on. But yes, it's one of those where, folks, like, forget about, I guess, the simple thoughts of what you think rail is. If you want to find out more, get in touch with Hez. He'll be happy to spend multiple hours with you, telling you everything, all the ins and outs of what it takes.
It's too much, and there's plenty of people that know a lot more than I do as well. So I can point you in their direction if I can't answer the question.
Absolutely. Well, look, folks, that's all the time we have for this episode. But remember, before you go, please do help us pay it forward by sharing a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to our guest, Hezron Ricketts. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and an absent Fel, it's bye for now.